Hi friends, well, today is the day. Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 is available right now. Grammatically, that's awkward, isn't it? Galaxy 1 and 2 are available would appear more correct, but really, for most people, they will be buying the double pack called Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 as a single product. So is rather than are is the best way to phrase it, even if it's awkward and needs a disclaimer like addendum. And that should be foreshadowing for this review itself. You honestly can't review this game without adding more asterisks than you find in your average French supermarket. The plural of asterisks is difficult to say, isn't it? Or is it just asterisks? I don't know. I nearly didn't even bother to put out this review, frankly. I've already covered this alleged collection in a huge amount of detail in no less than 3 previous episodes, and the subsequent sections separated out for YouTube clips too to gain the algorithm. First up was on the day of the Direct itself, both in my predictions before the show, where I correctly guessed that we would probably be getting access in some form to Super Mario Galaxy 2, given that it was the 40th anniversary of Mario, and we got Super Mario Galaxy 1 on the 35th anniversary, and at the time, the lack of inclusion of its sequel seemed like a strange omission within 3D All-Stars, unless Nintendo were going to pull a Disney Vault-style system with artificial scarcity and time-limited releases. But also, in that same episode, you would have heard my live reactions to the full reveal as it dropped. In a later episode, I discussed the entire 40th anniversary celebration with every announcement and spent over 25 minutes of that one going over the release of Galaxy 1 and 2 in detail, breaking down what would and wouldn't be included, talking about the pricing controversies, potential changes, etc., but also why I felt confident that this would be the definitive way to play these classic games. Let's see with this new review whether I was proved right. And then I also released a tier list episode breaking down the Direct and ranking how excited I was for each announcement, and Galaxy 1 and 2 confidently got an A tier ranking from me. Again, an asterisk being necessary that they are easily S tier games, but my hesitation about the way this particular re-release of them is being handled means that I bumped it down very slightly, more as a slight protest vote. But make no mistake, I was going to buy no matter what. And buy I did. Here we are on release date, and I actually got my filthy hands on a physical Switch boxed copy a day early. Not because of any YouTuber privileges, but because seemingly the predictability of delivery times in France, where I currently live, is all over the place, sometimes arriving early, sometimes late. Who cares about deadlines or algorithm and SEO catching dates? This time the gamble paid off, and I have been able to comfortably spend enough time with this particular version of the games to give the double pack a fair and detailed review. And it's a funny thing. While there are already several reviews of this double pack out there in the wild, many of them seem to be reviews of the two games themselves, but without the slightest mention of things like actual performance, actual changes, almost as if, heaven forbid, they decided not to bother paying the exorbitant price and just review the games that they have already owned for years and played many times before, maybe even emulated, and then just pretend to be reviewing this new version. YouTube is the new rock and roll decadence, money for nothing, clicks for free. Perhaps it's honesty, perhaps it's stupidity, perhaps it's brand loyalty, perhaps it's the fact that I'm a helpless collector and I was always going to stupidly buy this to put on the shelf anyway, and by making this episode I can at least claim the cost back as a tax expense. But I want to make clear that that is not what this is. Unlike my previous extensive coverage of Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, this particular episode is actually a genuine review of the finished final product, the package that is out to buy right now for the Nintendo Switch. And with updates for the Switch 2, I have extensively tested it out on both a Switch 1 and a Switch 2 and a Switch Lite as well. Not that I expected any difference really, in both docked and handheld modes for the 1 and 2. So I can give my full definitive opinion on whether you should buy this particular version of these two games, rather than just talking about the games and paying lip service to what everybody knows are the changes. I can actually give my opinions on the changes themselves and make my own personal observations, which seem to be lacking from some of the reviews out there, not casting any aspersions. This channel is a self-funded hobby. I don't get sent free review copies. I did pay for this with my own money, and my YouTube and Spotify channels aren't even monetized. So if you feel so inclined, a super thanks would really help keep the lights on and allow me to keep funding this foolish but hopefully entertaining endeavor. There is no obligation, of course. It's just that when there is a sticker shock quite as severe as several of these recent Nintendo products of late, it feels almost necessary to at least mention that YouTube has recently, thankfully, unlocked the feature for me and allowed people to support if they are able to and feel so inclined. Thank you in advance if anybody does. The price, of course, is the biggest factor that anyone has talked about thus far with this release, myself included, and we will get into it, though I don't want to focus too much of this review on that one particular factor. It's ground I've already covered extensively in previous episodes, as I mentioned, and even if this is the first time that you are finding this channel, if so, welcome. I hope you decide to subscribe and stick around. Even in that case, you have probably heard people discuss the cost at length ever since the day of this direct. Well, of course, the pricing and value proposition has to be a factor when reviewing a product. It's a pretty important one. The most important reason for checking out this review will be the new information gleaned from my finally playing the actual product, not stuff that we already knew and have discussed already into oblivion, tempting though it is to focus on a price when it seems quite as outlandish as this one obviously does. Indeed, when reviewing any kind of multi-game retro re-release, there are two potential ways to review the product itself, and I think that's clear from the pretty wide gamut of scores that we're currently seeing populating the Metacritic page as it fills out throughout the day. The one way to approach a product like this is just to base the score on the games themselves. The other way is to review the compilation for its contents and the quality of the presentation of what is included and what was chosen to be featured. If you just want a quick TLDR, the two games included themselves would make this a 10 out of 10 release if that was the only thing to factor in. I previously professionally reviewed them back when they first came out the first time round on the Wii, and from what I remember, I did give both of them 9 out of 10. They hold up extremely well. They've lost none of their charm, and in fact, I'd argue that in almost all ways, these new modern versions are the best way to play, with the occasional tiny caveat, which we will get into. I would say these are the definitive versions of the games. But if reviewing the release for the quality value prospect, the presentation of the package, the respect to the franchise rather than the games themselves, frankly, this is more of a 5 out of 10 at best. Only 2 games included on a more than full-priced release. Don't forget, this is on the Switch 1, so it's $10 more than the standard full price, when previously Nintendo themselves have sold the games for as low as $9 each. And the presentation here is about as bare bones and frankly disrespectful as you can get to the legacy of Mario and of these games. People complained about how lackluster the previous Mario 3D All-Stars was, and this is just as bad, actually worse, but with one less game and at $10 more. And while I hated the fact that 3D All-Stars was a time-limited release, That did at least ensure that nowadays it has a much higher resale value than Galaxy 1 and 2 ever will. You can't really claim that you're buying these as an investment. To give a demonstrative value of the difficulty when rating these types of releases, in my coverage of the same recent Nintendo Direct, I talked at length about the forthcoming Mortal Kombat Legacy collection. I put out a half-an-hour-long video giving a mini review of each of the 22 games included on that collection. The video's doing well, currently got more views than any of my Mario-related videos, funnily enough, and is still continuing to gain more watches and watch time as I record this episode. People are not only clicking it, but they're watching all the way to the end. Thank you very much if you're one of the people who did. But I did get a slightly snarky comment where somebody sarcastically commented that I was reviewing a game that wasn't available yet, but that's exactly what I wasn't doing, and it kind of proves my point of what I've just said. I was reviewing the games that Digital Eclipse chose to put on the compilation, reviewing my opinion of the games that they chose, games that maybe they should have included, but they didn't for whatever reason, but also talking about the games that they did choose to include, games which I already own and which have been available for many, many years, to give people who haven't played all 22, fair enough, most people won't have done, a fair idea of whether this particular compilation was of interest to them. And then, once the compilation actually does release, snarky commenter, I will be able to put out a separate review of the compilation itself, unburdened with having to spend ages going into all 22 games in detail when I've already done that, and rather concentrating on the compilation itself, the quality of the emulation, the options, the extensive museum and archive material that Digital Eclipse almost always include. It's possible to release an excellent compilation of terrible games, or a terrible compilation of excellent games. And yes, by the way, that was 22 games, not just 2 like Nintendo are putting out here. And the physical copy is only $44, not $70. Is there a single game on the compilation which even approaches the quality or historical importance of Galaxy 1 or 2? No. Even as a somewhat obsessive Mortal Kombat fan myself would admit that even the best of the games on the compilation couldn't really claim that. And actually, out of the 22 included, basically only 4 of them absolutely needed to be there, and the others are disposable throwaway titles that you might try once for the novelty factor, play for no more than 5 minutes, and then never ever want to touch them again. But they aren't included here because they were essential 10 out of 10 games that people are going to play for hours on end. They were included to give more historical context to the collection and present the series warts and all, to truly show a reflection of the series that will tie in with the huge amount of archive content, video interviews, interactive documentary that ties it all together in a celebration that long-term fans can feel proud of and enjoy diving in and out of. By contrast, Nintendo have gone the opposite route, only including 2 games here. Yes, they are 2 of the best games of all time. Yes, they have slightly updated both of them to make them arguably the best possible ways to play both titles, as I said. But considering this is Mario's 40th anniversary, only 2 games and essentially no museum, archive or celebratory content included at all, save for an extremely bare-bones music player, which includes music already available for free on the Nintendo Music app. Like I said, 10 out of 10 games, 5 out of 10 collection. In fact, collection should be in inverted commas, especially when you factor in the price that they're asking. Polygon perhaps said it best with a quote that is currently doing the rounds on social media. With the Galaxy remasters, Nintendo are offering 2 masterpieces for the price of 2. But yeah, as I said, you already know all of this. You already heard people discussing the price ad nauseum, and nauseous is what it does make me. You've probably heard people moaning about what should have been included to make this a more fitting and respectful celebration of Mario for the 40th, rather than a quick cash grab to milk money from loyal fans. My opinion, to briefly state, I suppose, at the very least, it should have been a proper 3D All-Stars collection, so we should have had Mario 64 and Sunshine here as well, but preferably, why not throw in the ROMs of the basic 2D games, Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, 3, Super Mario World, even if you don't want to include Yoshi's Island because you want to save that for a separate compilation. Heck, if they'd have included the Mario Land games for the Game Boy, I would have been over the moon. There was rumors that we were going to get some kind of new Super Mario Brothers compilation, and frankly, I don't really like the new Super Mario Brothers games that much. But again, a compilation of all of those games all together would have felt like a more complete compilation. And if they'd have gone the whole hog for the 40th anniversary and released a compilation that included basically all of the 2D mainline Mario games and the new Super Mario Brothers titles, and Mario 64, Sunshine, Galaxy 1 and 2. Frankly, even if they'd have charged $100, I think people would have said that that was better value and a better compilation. People would have been more happy, especially if they put it in a fancy box with an art book or something like that to make it seem like it was worth the $100. People would have been jumping for joy. Even people like myself who've already bought these games a million times over. But again, as I always say, we're not here to review what should have been. But again, so many people, myself included, have discussed all of this ad nauseum. I don't think you are listening to this particular review or watching this particular video for any of that. You want to know the actual genuine rundown of this exact release from somebody who has actually bought it, has it in hand, has spent a decent amount of time with it, and can review the exact changes, performance, and anything else that might sway you one way or the other with this particular review. To be clear, while I may sound somewhat negative so far in this coverage, I genuinely love these two games, and I do feel that this is the best way to play them. I imagine from this point onwards, this will be the way that I play these games, and I do regularly replay these games. So having these new versions being the definitive ways to play, and the most convenient, let's face it, is a pretty great thing. I do not regret my purchase in the slightest, and I do feel that even though the cost is higher than I would have liked, I do feel that I've more than got my money's worth here. But it's not up to me to tell you whether you will feel the same way. It's just up to me to give you enough new information to be able to form an opinion on whether you are likely to also feel that this particular version of these two games is worth your time and money. And I'll even wrap up by suggesting some ways that you could potentially get these versions for less cash than the naysayers, myself included, might have led you to believe thus far. I'll dive right into that galaxy of deets after I just quickly read the obligatory podcast intro. And as always, if you're a regular listener that skips the intros, welcome back, and just please remember to leave a like as you're doing so. It really does help me out. Thank you, and I'll see you on the other side. Hi everyone, welcome to Daily Switch 2, a podcast covering everything related to the Nintendo Switch 2, attempting to release at least one new episode or video per day to YouTube, Spotify, and your favourite major platforms. My name is Sam. I've been a gamer since the 1980s. I've worked in the entertainment industry since I was a teenager, including as a games journalist, producer of gaming documentaries and shows, and I'm even programming multiple indie video games, including 4 which will be released on the Switch and hopefully Switch 2, with the first one being announced this October. Yes, this month that has just started right now. So be sure to subscribe and follow the show for the world-exclusive news on these as they drop, along with some other exciting Nintendo-related projects that I have on the back burner. However, I'm a gamer and Nintendo fan at heart, and this podcast is primarily a passion project for me to talk about the stuff that interests and excites me about this new system. It's not funded by Nintendo or any other entity except my own indie games company, of course, and any sponsors or even free review copies will be very clearly stated so that I can remain completely unofficial and unbiased and give my full, frank, honest opinions. In general, I fund this entirely by myself. As I said, I actually buy the hardware and the games that I talk about so I can give a real objective opinion on if they are worth your cash or not. This means it's obviously an expensive hobby to run the show, so if you do want to support what I'm doing, you can now leave a super thanks or buy me a coffee, but there's no obligation to do so in this economy. And with game prices what they are, I just really appreciate a like, subscribing, and I try my darndest to read, like, and respond to every comment that you guys leave. We're building a nice community here, and I absolutely notice returning viewers, so I'm grateful for the continued support. And speaking of communities, I'm in the process of revamping the Patreon and building a YouTube membership option too, but please be reassured that I don't believe in paywalls. I will never hide content behind them, and on Patreon I do offer a completely free tier. Everyone is welcome, there's never any pressure to donate, and I just want to build a fun community where you can talk to me, leave suggestions, get the latest news on my own games that I'm developing, and once it gets big enough, I've got some really cool community events planned. I do free monthly giveaways of official Nintendo prizes, toys, trinkets, Pokemon cards, posters, even the occasional Switch game. The first one of those will be in our forthcoming 1000 subscriber special. There is never any paywall, never any cost to enter, so be sure to visit linktree/dailyswitch2 to join the free members area, and for all the ways to listen, watch and support the show, check out that description, pin comment, or here's that link again. It's super easy, linktree/dailyswitch2, that's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. Thank you so much, and back to the review. Okay, so right off the back of that introduction, I guess it's worth stating that yes, this is the Daily Switch 2 podcast, and the goal is to cover every Switch 2 game. But every now and again, it does make sense to cover a Switch 1 game as well. And in the case of this particular game, it's one of those that actually kind of skates the border between the two. Yes, the physical edition is a Switch 1 game on a Switch 1 cart. There is no Nintendo Switch 2 edition boxed copy like they did with Mario Party Jamboree or the forthcoming Super Mario Bros. Wonder that we covered recently, Bella Bell Park and all. But instead, they've decided to go the route of Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, and of course, Super Mario Odyssey itself, arguably the true follow-up to Galaxy 2, and instead just released a free performance update patch. That means if you play the game on the Switch 2, you will have a better experience. This isn't a paid update because it doesn't add any extra content, save for some different control options, which we'll cover later. But instead, it's a free update that just improves the performance of the base game. Nice that this is included for free, though. Given the steep price of entry, I imagine there could have been rioting in the streets had they tried to charge more. As I mentioned in the intro, I don't think that many people, if any, will be coming to this review looking for a pure review of the games themselves as standalone experiences with no previous knowledge of what they are or how they play. This is already going to be a long episode and I don't want to waste everyone's time. So if you are one of the tiny fraction of people with no knowledge of these games, I'd say there's literally nearly 2 decades of people having already reviewed and analysed the games better than I can here. But basically, it's 3D Mario in space. Bowser's kidnapped Peach as usual, but this time he's stolen her castle too, literally lifting it up into the air, taking it away, while trying to dispose of Mario by blasting him into space. Mario meets a new princess. It's the very first appearance of Rosalina, who I'm sure you know from other games, who basically helps point him in the right direction, and he must collect stars and move between planets and galaxies, shooting through special stars to get closer and closer to Peach each time. It controls very similarly to Super Mario 64 and Odyssey, arguably tighter, although with some restrictions, which we'll get to, and more polished than Sunshine's controls, many people think. And the main gimmick here is, of course, that you are in space, so there's lots of opportunity to play around with gravity and movement in ways previously not possible, running around spheres, walking on ceilings, etc. They're used in ever more and more creative and interesting ways over time. Galaxy 2 was essentially more of the same, but with a slightly different and less detailed plot. This time, instead of navigating via stars and moving around Rosalina's observatory, you fly around instead on a spaceship bizarrely shaped like Mario's head. And the main difference is this time you get to control and ride Yoshi sometimes, righting a wrong that many of us have felt since the end of Mario 64. Both games are considered two of the very best games on the Wii, two of the best Mario games, heck, two of the best Nintendo games ever made. It's arguable that even Mario Odyssey wasn't quite as polished or well designed as Galaxy, and to many since its release, it's been the shining example of Nintendo's creativity when traditional limitations are removed. The bosses especially are a real highlight of the entire Mario series, and these, combined with it being the first time that a Nintendo game got a full orchestral soundtrack, left Galaxy and its sequel being the most epic that a Mario game had ever felt to that point, and that feeling remains to this day. Simply put, these are timeless games. So, let's talk about the performance then, as that's probably the thing that people will be the most interested in when seeking out reviews of this particular release of these two games. Both games in their original releases for Wii ran at 480p, 4:3, and mostly a stable 60 FPS, save for a few particularly busy or complex areas. The subsequent re-releases on the Wii U, those were the ones that had been on sale previously for as low as $9 each, by the way, performed exactly the same, as they were basically just using the console's built-in Wii compatibility mode and only just looked slightly better because of the cleaner HDMI output of the newer console. On Switch 1, both games here are now in widescreen, targeting 1080p when docked and hitting 60 FPS for the vast majority of the time. There are occasional frame dips, but it's so occasional that you won't really notice. Slightly more noticeable is the fact that it is a variable dynamic resolution. Yes, it targets 1080p, but it's not locked there, unfortunately. I noticed a few areas where I felt things suddenly were slightly less clean, a bit fuzzier, and it made me suspicious. So with no way to check it myself, I went to the ever-reliable Digital Foundry and confirmed what I saw. It can dip all the way down to 810p, though it's worth saying that you will only really notice that when playing docked on a large TV. Obviously, all models of the Switch 1, including the OLED and Switch Lite, all have a 720p screen, so when playing on that, it's basically crisp and locked constantly, and I've got to say, it looks very nice. When factoring in the switch from 4:3 to widescreen as well, 720p is 3 times as many pixels and 1080p is nearly 7 times as many. When we're talking about a 3D game with polygonal graphics, that makes a lot of difference as to how smooth the graphics, especially on the edges of objects, will look. And while for some old games this extra resolution can expose how low poly or blocky the original models were, in the case of Galaxy 1 and 2, these were always extremely nicely modelled graphics, and frankly, they now look just as good as many modern games and haven't really aged a bit, in my opinion. On Switch 2, it's even better, essentially perfect. When docked, it runs at a full 4K 2160p, or 27 times the number of pixels of the original games. And it's a locked resolution, no dynamic scaling on the Switch 2. And I didn't notice any frame dips at all, other than the normal single frame when switching camera, as has always happened, because it's in the programming code of how the game's engine itself works. Another upgrade I noticed is that it seems that the LOD, level of detail changes of models in the distance, simply don't happen on the Switch 2. It just uses the full versions all the time. Either that or the swap happens so far away that it was no longer perceptible to me. And there's always been an optimization when certain items and enemies didn't have shadows until they're within a certain distance from you. Again, on the Switch 2, this happens much, much farther away to make it basically imperceivable on Switch 2, except in extreme circumstances. I'm not entirely sure, as I haven't had the time or inclination to check, but while the optimization and LOD stuff is slightly worse on the Switch 1, I would wager that it is still far better than it was on the original Wii/Wii U. And frankly, it was never bad in the first place. It's not like half the frame rate movement from Kirby Forgotten Land, for example, where it can be actively distracting having the stuff in the background looking worse. So yeah, the Switch 1 version looks wonderful, while the Switch 2 version docked is essentially flawless. Again, obviously in portable mode you do have a lower resolution, but the 1080p is higher than the Switch 1's 720p, even if the colours and crisp refresh versus ghosting might mean that some people will prefer how this looks on the OLED Switch over the Switch 2 when handheld, until we get a new Switch 2 refresh with probably a 1440p OLED. So if you're purely a handheld gamer, then you could argue which is technically going to look better to your eyes. But as far as on a big TV, yeah, it's night and day. The Switch 1 is great, but the Switch 2 version is much crisper, completely locked at 60 FPS with no dynamic resolution. So yeah, as I said, it is essentially flawless, gorgeous looking. I did initially wonder during the announcements whether the 4K on the Switch 2 would simply be the 1080p output of the Switch 1 version, just DLSS upscaled to 4K or something similar, rather than being a full separate parallel build. But having pixel peeped, I can confidently say that I don't think that's the case. Frankly, it makes me wonder why Nintendo seemed so shy to upload 4K footage to YouTube, and all trailers appear to be using the Switch 1 footage. Oh well, I've given up on trying to make sense of Nintendo's marketing decisions lately. I'll just say that this looks as good as you'd want it to, and leave it at that. Similar to the lack of DLSS, it's worth noting that there is no image after processing filters, as far as I can tell, at all. So, no anti-aliasing, for example. Personally, to me, this is actually a good thing, but some people will think that it should have been included to smooth out the edges of the Switch 1 version at least. Though I'm sure this would have affected the performance for the Switch 1, and frankly for the Switch 2 version at 4K, I don't actually feel it's even slightly necessary, and would just have made the picture less clean, in my opinion. We aren't trying to give photorealism here, are we? We're trying to make the cartoony visuals just pop as much as possible, and pop they do. Galaxy 1 and 2 have never looked as good as this, even when upscaling with unofficial emulators. Part of the reason the graphics also look nicer than if only using upscaling is that pretty dramatic improvements have been made to the texture maps and 2D HUD images too, and overall I'm happy with the changes and think that they improve things pretty dramatically, although there are some caveats. First slightly weird choice is that the 2D HUD elements have all been redrawn to 1080p but not 4K, and 1080p doesn't integer scale perfectly into 4K, so that results in the HUD graphics being very slightly soft when playing in 4K. However, frankly, it is only noticeable if you really pixel peep, and they still look infinitely better than the original 480p ones would have done if just upscaled like on an emulator. I don't think these are just the original files re-exported at a higher resolution. In fact, in most cases things are definitely changed, so it's slightly baffling to me why they wouldn't just target 4K as the default and then downres them for lower resolutions, rather than picking one in between the 720 minimum and 2160 maximum. But not able to cleanly integer scale between either. Perhaps they figured because of the much larger user base, more people would be playing on Switch 1, and therefore it's better to target the highest quality docked resolution, I don't know. It can't have been that much extra work or take up too much extra storage space just to export multiple versions of each PNG image now, can it? But I don't know, really, I've already talked about this far longer than is necessary. It is not a big deal at all, I promise. The new HUD is a big improvement. It looks great, and even at 4K, and most importantly, its resolution is consistent with itself. So all 2D elements on screen are consistent, even if the 3D polygonal resolution will be slightly crisper when docked with the Switch 2. It is not a problem. I mostly only mention it because I noticed it and I thought it was kind of a weird choice. A bigger issue for some might be the new textures. New in inverted commas because in many cases they look basically identical to the originals, but just as if they've been re-exported at a much higher resolution, so you can now see more details on the new higher resolution screens. In the cases where they essentially look the same but better, I can't imagine anyone complaining. They look genuinely great. But there has been some controversy online of people complaining that certain very specific textures in very specific places look worse. Again, worse in inverted commas because it is just a matter of taste. They certainly do look different. It seems that because of the much higher resolution, the design team decided that they could be more subtle with some of the details of certain areas, mostly in places involving fine texture detail. So, for example, surfaces that may have had large visible cracks or imperfections before might now look more plain and smooth, or at least until the camera is close enough to them so that you can see that there is, in fact, a detailed texture there. It's just far more subtle. This may have always been the intention of the developers and artists, but the previous imperfections were necessarily much larger previously because they had far less pixels to work with. But it can mean that in some very specific areas, things will look cleaner and perhaps less rough and organic, especially when the camera is further away. I previously speculated that because it was so rare and happened in such specific parts of the specific shots in specific trailers, it may have just been either a temporary texture or even just a quirk of an internal upscaling or even just compression on YouTube itself, smoothing out details. But now, having played the actual game and having it in hand, I can confirm that while most of the textures look kind of identical to the original, just more detailed, some textures have definitely been significantly changed, and you may feel that there are certain surfaces where the newer textures look worse than the originals. However, I do think that this is so rare and in such small specific instances that I'm more than comfortable in saying that overall these new textures are a major upgrade over the originals, and it does look like thought and care has gone into recreating and swapping them out rather than just running everything blanketly through a quick and dirty AI upscale. Speaking of quick and dirty upscales, that's exactly what the pre-rendered cutscenes seemed to have gotten in the 3D All-Stars version of Galaxy 1, and I'm very happy to report that they look much better here. Perhaps improved with AI, I don't know, but I would venture that they actually look more like they still had the original project files and re-rendered them in a higher quality. Again, the results here are far better than you would get using an emulator, further adding to my opinion that these are the best overall looking ways to play Galaxy 1 and 2, even considering unofficial emulation. However, while there are a huge improvement on the originals, the pre-rendered cutscenes are probably the area that I'm the most disappointed in, as I feel that they could have looked even better. The codec that has been used seems quite low bitrate, so there is noticeable artifacts, especially when on a large TV, and color banding is noticeable in certain places. It's not serious, it still looks infinitely better than any previous version released, including the 3D All-Stars version of Galaxy 1. But if they did have access to the original files and managed to re-render them in perfect lossless quality, it's a shame that they then made them look worse than they needed to be by using a low bitrate format for transcoding them for the cartridge itself. I'm guessing they were trying to hit some kind of compromise as far as file sizes go, either for download or cartridge size considerations, or maybe the Switch One couldn't handle playing video at a higher bitrate. But if that was the case, I'd have really liked the option for the Switch 2 users to be able to download less lossy video files if they wanted to and didn't mind sacrificing some storage space. Again, though, I feel compelled to restate that while I'm pointing out small issues and ways that I feel that these could have been very slightly graphically better, nothing that I've mentioned here is a problem, and these games both look absolutely amazing. Not just the best that they've ever looked, but as I said, these could easily pass as modern brand new games. Galaxy 1 and 2 have always been beautiful games, but this is the best incarnation of them that we have ever had by a very large margin. They both look and perform absolutely brilliantly, and on Switch 2 it is close to flawless. It's worth noting also that while the Switch 1 version of Galaxy 1 did have the redrawn HUD, or a redrawn HUD, I don't think it's the same, high resolution and widescreen, it just used the original Wii textures for the 3D model. So even if you already own the 3D All-Stars version and will only be playing on the Switch 1, this version of Galaxy 1 is not the same as the 3D All-Stars version of Galaxy 1. This new version will look better. Whether that makes it worth buying a second time is up to you, but just know that it's not the same version, it is slightly updated. And as for how the game plays, well, in general, if you have played these games before, nothing important has changed. These aren't ground-up modern remakes in Unreal Engine or whatever, which end up completely ruining the feel of the original. Sadly, I'm looking at you, my precious, precious monkey target. Press F to pay respects. There also isn't any worry about poor emulation resulting in lag or otherwise unresponsive controls. What we have here is confirmed to be a hybrid that skirts the line in between native port and emulation. The original code has been ported to run natively on the Switch's CPU, but the graphics, sound, and other features are using emulation from Nintendo's own Wii emulator, which I've never been sure how to pronounce. Hagi, Hagi, Hello, Helitea, quand je donne ma langue au chat, je vois les autres. The one area where some minor changes had to be made is the control methods to make up for the fundamental differences between the Wii hardware and the Switch and Switch 2's multiple configurations. To go on a brief mini rant, one of the reasons that I particularly dislike Nintendo hardware gimmicks and have often spoken against them, and in the run-up to the Switch 2 being announced, both as a games dev myself and just a long-term fan, I was pretty vocal about my hopes that the Switch 2 didn't try and reinvent the wheel too much and basically was just a more powerful Switch 1. Is every time that Nintendo does something unique with its hardware that fundamentally changes how you either control or view the games, that means that we're less likely to be able to play those same games on later generations' hardware in the future, or compromises will have to be made at least. For example, there are many DS or 3DS games that would be nigh on impossible to release on the Switch or Switch 2 because of the lack of dual screens and of course no 3D. Unless for the 3D they use some kind of SBS accessory, which leads us to the Virtual Boy accessory announced during the same Direct. Again, Virtual Boy games have basically been held hostage in the past and impossible to release, and even now it's only really possible by spending up to $100 on a separate accessory. Most Wii U games have now been ported to the Switch, of course, except for my beloved Woolly World, which I'm still hoping will be announced soon. But after that, the only major first-party games that will be really left unplayable on modern hardware are Nintendo Land and Star Fox Zero, both games designed specifically to show off the uniqueness of the hardware, and therefore both completely, basically lost in time and unable to be satisfactorily ported or emulated on anything other than the original Wii U and its gamepad. Now, obviously Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 don't have anywhere near as many problems porting them, but the unique control scheme of the Wii does prove impossible to completely satisfactorily replicate on the Switch 1 or 2. In the original games, of course, you held the Wii nunchuck in your left hand for analog movement and the Wiimote in your right, and often used the Wiimote to point at things on screen using the sensor bar. This can be somewhat approximated when playing on TV or in tabletop mode on Switch by not using a Pro Controller or the puppy grip and instead holding a Joy-Con in each hand. The gyro motion sensor can approximate the pointer, but due to limits of that technology, they will drift and do need to be recentered and calibrated fairly often by pressing R, which is necessary to do often enough to the point that the ever-wandering cursor becomes a mild annoyance or distraction unless you hide it. If you're playing on Switch 2, apparently a second player can use mouse mode to control it instead, but of course that's only possible if playing in a kind of broken up task-delegated co-op multiplayer rather than being a solution that can be done in single player, because you need to use the stick and buttons on the second Joy-Con, so you can't have mouse mode for single player. I've not tested this mouse mode nor any other co-op configuration as I've only played in single player so far, but I've actually heard that the mouse mode may not be available at launch and will come with an update, ? But other people reviewing the game seem to have tested it already, so maybe it was a day one patch that downloaded with the Switch 2 version when you put the game into your Switch 2. I don't know. When playing handheld or indeed playing on a Switch Lite where that's your only choice, you can use gyro to move the cursor, though to my mind that will never really be a satisfactory compromise because obviously as you move the unit, you move the screen that you're trying to stare at, potentially causing problems with reflections, lighting, etc. Also, moves which on the Wii were previously mapped to motion controls like flicking the Wiimote are disabled and you have to do a button press. This is not a problem for me as I've never really been a big motion control guy, and whenever I have the choice to use real physical controls instead, I will. In fact, now that I've said it, I'm even wondering, does the Switch Lite even have gyro controls? I'm not entirely sure because I never use gyro controls. I hate them. I love the Switch Lite. I use it all the time, but like I say, motion control's not really for me. Of course, gyro drift issues will still happen in handheld mode, but a more precise option is to use the touch screen to literally touch what you're trying to point at. Again, this is less than perfect compromise, though, because you have to take your hand off the other controls and temporarily be unable to jump, etc., unless I guess you used your nose or something. And also, perhaps it's just me, but I've always hated how touchscreen controls leave you vulnerable to fingerprints on the very screen that you are looking at for your gameplay. It works fine, but again, it's a compromise and it's less than perfect than on the original hardware control setup that the games were designed for in the first place. There's an option to play a two-player co-op again, with the second player basically only controlling the cursor to collect items or attack enemies, etc. But this time using the two Joy-Cons, one for each player, and holding them on their side, NES style. But using the gyro too. This looks really awkward to me, but more options is always welcome, I guess. In the options, you can switch between original controls or modern controls. Now, this sounds fancy, but in reality, it's just a toggle between whether the axes are inverted or not. Axes are inverted or not. I'm very glad the option is there. See my recent embarrassing performance when testing out Pokemon Legends ZA at an event in France where the camera was basically backwards to how my brain works. But I wasn't sure how to ask to invert them in French. MDR, désolé, géante. But I think it would have been a lot clearer if they just specified that what the change actually was, rather than this modern or original moniker rubbish. I suppose my main objections to the control method being called modern in inverted commas is it implies that there are meaningful changes and improvements. There simply are none. It just swaps the axis. As I said, this isn't really a remake. It's the same code that's always been there running the game, with minor changes just injected into it. For most people, myself included, this isn't a bad thing, as the game's always controlled near perfectly anyway. With 3D platformers, it seems the only issue that always rears its ugly head is the camera. Even in the sublime, near-perfect Donkey Kong Bonanza, the camera can occasionally flip out and be in the wrong place because of how complicated it is, with the fact that you can basically destroy anything and climb through anything and break through and tunnel through anything. Not sure how you would fix that camera issue in that case, but with Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, the problem is slightly different. Because of the nature of constantly blasting between different small planets and areas with different rules for gravity, the camera will sometimes have to very quickly completely readjust where it is in relation to Mario and the screen itself, meaning that suddenly you have to change how the analog stick is aligned when compared to the screen. This is done automatically in most cases, and if you're like me, you quickly learn to just let go of the analog stick and let it recenter every time that Mario is flying between the areas and you're not actually controlling him. But I know that historically some people have said that they found that they naturally don't do that, but instead hold the stick in the direction that Mario is flying, even though they aren't actually controlling him at the moment. If this is your instinct, then you will sometimes find that when you land, the analog stick moves Mario in the wrong, inverted commas, direction compared to the orientation of the camera. If that ever happens to you, it's easy to fix. It's just a case of letting go of the stick so he stops still for just a microsecond while it readjusts. Personally, I've never found this an issue, but if you are one of the people that found this a problem, it won't be fixed here. The camera and the way that Mario controls are identical. They aren't broken, you just need to stop subconsciously holding the stick in a particular direction when gravity is in the middle of adjusting to a different orientation. Similarly, while most people will probably never notice, the movement in the Galaxy games has never been fully analog. Mario moves in what appears to be maybe 16 different directions, depending on where the stick is being pushed. Presumably, again, because of how the constantly changing gravity works and how it works out how the camera should be aligned to it from a programming perspective. Again, this is not a problem unless you are super hypersensitive to it, but again, using modern as a name for one of the control setups might imply to some people that the controls have been improved or changed. They haven't. They are exactly the same that they've always been. To most people, myself included, the controls have always felt perfect and precise. But if you were one of the few people that didn't like them, I'm afraid that nothing here is updated except being able to invert the axis and having multiple less than perfect options for how to move the cursor and collect your star bits, etc., given the lack of Wiimote pointer and sensor bar. Now, as for the controls, again, I feel like I'm complaining or painting a picture of these versions not playing well. This couldn't be further from the truth. Mario and Yoshi control as perfectly, in my opinion, as they always did. And if anything, the game's better performance makes them feel even better to play, and now you have more and better options. For me, on a TV with a Pro Controller or equivalent, it will always be my preference for any game. And with Galaxy 1 and 2 on Wii, I always just love them despite the motion controls, not because of them. So here, I'm glad that they can mostly move out of the way. But yeah, the cursor controls specifically will feel slightly awkward and less than perfect no matter what configuration you use, and whether you're on Switch 1 or 2, whether you're handheld or docked or tabletop. But it's in no way game-breaking. In fact, for those that haven't played the games before, it is worth mentioning that you can basically just complete the whole game hardly ever needing to use the cursor. If it annoys you, you can just move it so it's off screen and you don't see it and just play without it for 95% of the time. That's actually how I play most of the time. On the rare occasions when I actually need the cursor, I just press R to recenter it and it pops back to the middle of the screen ready to use. And then when I've finished with it, I hide it away again so it's floating off the screen and not there annoying me by being there when I don't want it to be. In many ways, this reminds me of the Switch version of Captain Toad Treasure Tracker. I've mentioned before that I love that game, one of my favourites ever, and along with Woolly World, probably my favourite two Wii U exclusives back in the day. Similarly, Galaxy 1 and 2 are definitely my favourite games on the Wii, but the games were designed to sometimes use certain features of the gamepad or Wiimote respectively, which aren't able to be perfectly replicated on the Switch. So you end up with very slightly compromised versions of the games, but they are still the definitive versions because they have better graphics and performance and add new content, making them the best versions overall. And as for new content, what do we have in Galaxy 1 and 2? Well, I covered this all at length in my previous coverage, and while it's not a huge amount, I think, to me, it does make these versions the definitive ones without a doubt. To summarize quickly, first up is accessibility options, which if you don't need them won't seem important at all, but for those that do need or want them, I'm sure they will be extremely welcome, perhaps even essential. These are great games, so having them playable for a wider range of people is obviously something that I wholeheartedly welcome, even if they aren't features that I will ever personally use myself. Your assist mode basically doubles your health, allows it to regenerate when you stand still for a minute. Also, if you miss a jump or fall off a ledge, instead of dying, a bubble will come and rescue you and bring you back to where you fell from. The least important is Amiibo functionality. There's 2 forthcoming, overly expensive in my opinion, Galaxy Amiibos coming out in April. These will spawn a health mushroom and a 1-up mushroom respectively when you use them. Other existing Mario series Amiibo will spawn things like coins, etc. None of this is really particularly useful when you consider the aforementioned accessibility options where you can just regenerate health and where you never die. It makes the game easier for those that need them anyway, so why would you ever want to pick up an Amiibo and place it to get an extra life? I don't know, it seems strange. The new Amiibos do look quite nice, but it's weird to me that they aren't out in time to coincide with the game. However, don't forget that the new Super Mario Bros. Movie sequel is also themed around Super Mario Galaxy and also releasing in April, so presumably this game will be getting a soft relaunch around that time and a lot of publicity. I'd hazard a guess that they are only releasing it now rather than waiting till April to be able to call it a part of the 40th anniversary special and to fill the gap in the release windows between now and Christmas, not to mention the financial year starts and ends in April. So if they worry that software sales are underperforming for this particular financial year, a new big Mario platformer is a guaranteed seller, so that could help the situation somewhat. It also can't hurt that this new release might make more people newly aware of Mario Galaxy and then help promote the movie. While, of course, all major Nintendo fans know about the Galaxy titles, there will be many older generations of more casual, movie-going parents and grandparents who knew the Mario games on the NES, SNES or Game Boy, but have no knowledge of the newer games, but maybe got back into Nintendo with the Switch or bought one for their kids. So it's possible that this may be the first time that they're hearing about Mario Galaxy and will therefore make the movie sequel suddenly going into space seem less left field and like a desperate gimmick and more familiar and part of Mario canon. Of course, it's possible that we'll get a Mario Galaxy 3 game releasing in time for the movie too. If that's the case, I hope it is a Switch 2 exclusive, a la DK Bonanza. But frankly, that seems both unlikely and a little too soon. I imagine that we will be getting a 3D Mario game for the Switch 2 at some point, but it's more likely to be an original title with its own theme or gimmick. In general, Nintendo don't really do straight-up sequels for 3D Mario. Galaxy 2 was the exception to the rule, but arguably it was more of a full-priced expansion pack than a true sequel, and that's backed up both by its original development title and also by the fact that it was basically a fairly rushed release to try and quickly bring together another real gamers game to the Wii at a time when software sales were slumping and the opinion amongst gamers had largely turned to where the Wii by that point had become technologically left behind and known mostly for shovelware, kids games and waggle heavy games. But now that's not to say that Mario Galaxy 2 is a bad game, or even in any way worse or less substantial than Galaxy 1. In fact, many people prefer it, and I think that I might be in that camp too. I love the addition of Yoshi, and some of the themes and level designs are absolutely incredible. But the way the game was set up did always make it feel more like an expansion pack of tons of high-quality levels rather than an extension of the original game's story or even a standalone game in its own right. I'm tempted to compare it to the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2, but only in so much as it's just not that different enough to feel like a new game, and it's more like a harder version of the first game with some new features for people that already mastered the first game and want more of the same, but with some variety and extra challenge. Still, that's not to undermine the sheer variety or quality of the content. It's excellent and far more of its own experience than you might imagine with that Mario Bros. 2 comparison. Perhaps that's unkind. It's far from the perfect analogy, so don't run too far with it in your mind. But this is where, for me at least, this new re-release goes the extra mile and rights a wrong in a way. In this new re-release, when you complete Super Mario Galaxy 1, you get a new chapter at the end of Rosalina's book, an epilogue of sorts, and Galaxy 2, which never previously had chapters, now continues her book, so the games feel more thematically and stylistically linked together. I used this analogy in a previous video, but it really does remind me of how back in the day you could play just Sonic 3 or just Sonic and Knuckles by themselves if you only had one of the cartridges. Both were good games, both were fun, both had a beginning, middle and end. You could play them by themselves and be satisfied. But when you combine the two together, you get Sonic 3 and Knuckles, both combined as one long adventure, and it feels like it's the way that it was always meant to be played. While Galaxy 1 and 2 are still separate games in this collection and also still available to buy separately as digital downloads, I think that most people are going to want to play one directly after the other, and when you do, it makes the whole thing feel far more seamlessly like one cohesive experience. I know that most people don't care about plot in a Mario game, but to me at least, this does make a huge difference in how the overall experience feels. So, yeah, as I just mentioned, you can buy the games separately as digital downloads. For example, if like myself you already bought 3D All-Stars, so feel like you already own Galaxy 1, you could save yourself some cash by just buying Galaxy 2. Perhaps if you're a digital-only player, this makes some semblance of sense, but again, without wanting to harp on too much about the price, the digital download costs are quite literally insane to me. $70 for a double pack of 2 games physically is already way too steep, especially when it's a Switch 1 cart in Switch 1 packaging, where every single game has been $60 or less, except for Tears of the Kingdom, which we were at the time very apologetically, don't forget, told was necessary because of the unexpectedly large development costs of that specific game only. That can't possibly be an excuse this time round, so the second only ever $70 cartridge for the system being barely updated ports of 2 old games with an extremely bare bones basic JPEG menu and music player is just bizarre. But then factor in that if the physical version is expensive at $70, then a digital version at the same price seems even worse. And then if you buy the games individually, they're not even $35 each, they are $40 each. That is so overpriced to be genuinely upsetting. Let's diffuse the tension by saying that Nintendo only priced it at $40 to help celebrate the 40th anniversary of Mario. Guffaw. Seriously though, $40 for a digital copy of a nearly 2-decade-old game that you previously sold for $9 is insane. Even if there are slightly prettier graphics and some cutscenes and accessibility features. It's the best version of Galaxy 2, yes, without a doubt in my mind, but is it worth more than 4 times the cost? Just to save yourself the extra dollars of not having to buy Galaxy 1 again? But here's the secret though. For whatever reason, many retailers are already selling the physical version much cheaper than Nintendo's suggested retail price. Shop around, and in some territories you will be able to find the boxed version of both together for closer to that $40 than you might imagine. I don't want to name names or provide links because they will probably sell out or raise the prices. But yeah, there are many shops selling this at far less than retail, even on the first day of release. And as this is a game which, unlike 3D All-Stars, isn't limited in production number, I reckon if you wait a few months, you'll be able to pick up a second-hand version for $40 easily. Probably around February would be your best bet, not only months after the release, so many people will have bought it, played it, got tired of it and traded it in to get another game, but also significantly after Christmas and the New Year's sales rush, so demand will be the lowest around February. But if you go with this tactic, obviously make sure that you do buy it before the hype for the movie coming out in April. So yeah, if I were a betting man, your best price point would be around that kind of February mark. Much better to wait a few months to save money and end up with 2 full games on cartridge and have the option to resell in the future, rather than rushing to pay the exact same price or potentially even more for just a non-transferable digital-only copy of one of the games, because you have the false idea that you're saving money. To summarize then, to me, these are 2 of the best games ever made, no question. And despite some minor niggles, these are the definitive way to play them, especially for Galaxy 2, or when playing them both back to back as one story. I can't imagine that I will ever want to go back to other versions. They look and play brilliantly on the Switch 1, but if you have a Switch 2, and especially if you play docked on the Switch 2, this is an absolutely transformational experience. They look as good as many modern titles, and the gameplay and design are as good as they have ever been. These games are without a doubt timeless classics, and for a Mario or Nintendo fan, these games are basically essential. If somehow you haven't played them before, you are in for an absolute treat. And if you haven't played them since you were a young whippersnapper on the Wii, they are as good as your nostalgia remembers, and then some. Even if you regularly replay them via other methods, these are worth upgrading to, and you should find them a genuine upgrade, in my opinion. If you already own 3D All-Stars, this version of Galaxy 1 is improved over that version, although only slightly, and you will likely be able to find a physical copy of the double pack with 1 and 2 for about the same, or maybe even less than the cost of the separate digital purchase, either now or in a few months. The only true things to complain about are the price tag and the bare-bones nature of the collection. With a more reasonable price, a couple of other older games included, and the barest minimum of just historic image galleries and maybe a short documentary-esque video included, this would have been a no-brainer to recommend to all, and an easy 10 out of 10. However, the price tag, combined with the distaste left in the mouth by how little effort went into presenting and celebrating and respecting the games, especially as it was purportedly for the 40th anniversary, make it hard to rate it above an 8 out of 10 as a collection or as individual digital purchases at that $40 price tag. But don't get me wrong, in no way is that 8 out of 10 a reflection on the quality of the games themselves. If you don't care about the price or the presentation and you just want to score for the games rather than a score for the collection, these have always been 2 9s, and with the improvement and the fact that they now seamlessly play back to back in a satisfying way, I can see a world where that experience combined could be a 10. I'd still buy Donkey Kong Bonanza before this, but on Switch 2, this is probably now the second best 3D platform experience, even beating out Kirby's Star-Crossed Worlds. Great stuff. Truly great. Like once in a generation, or twice in a generation, I guess. Just a shame about that price tag though, isn't it? Thanks for listening, watching. Thank you in advance for liking, subscribing if you haven't already. Thank you if you have already. Please leave a comment. I would love to know what you think about these games. If you have good memories of them, if you're picking up these versions, if you're waiting for a sale, maybe you think I'm completely off base and the new controls just break the game and the Wii is still the best experience because of that unique pointer control. Whatever the case, I would love to hear from you. And if you want to support the show, help me make more episodes like this on YouTube, you can now leave a super thanks, don't forget. And you can always buy me a coffee, join the Patreon, which does include a free tier, by the way, and find all other links at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you all again soon. Later.